And welcome back. A good number of years ago, I met my wonderful wife, Tara, at a conference. The conference was called East Meets East. It was about yoga and Buddhism. And at that time, I was pretty strongly affiliated with the yoga tradition. Tara was strongly affiliated with the Buddhist tradition, and we kind of had at. It was the yoga team and the Buddha team. And it was a really wonderful conference, but it was one of those moments of just meeting someone who you feel is kind of tied into destiny. We both kind of felt that. And after the conference, we moved into a kind of a torrid email romance, which grew into an instant message romance. This was back when all there was AOL, Instant Messenger. And so we were like just going back and forth, kind of hot and heavy electronically. And as we're going back and forth, she sent me this text. And it went like this. What is the difference between your existence and that of a saint? A saint knows that the spiritual path is a sublime chess game with God, and that the beloved has just made such a fantastic move that the saint is now continually tripping over joy and bursting out in laughter and saying, I surrender. Whereas, my dear, I'm afraid you still think you have 1,000 serious moves. So I read that text, I thought, geez, that's pretty forward and a little aggressive. And also, how does she know me so well? I later realized that she had sent me a quote from Rumi. 1,000 serious moves. Boy, isn't that an apt description of our lives? Kind of this grim determination of how am I going to navigate my way through this maze of this human incarnation. I'd like to talk about a topic, another word mentioned in that quote, which is surrender. What is surrender? How do we bring surrender consciously into our practice? So I'd like to talk about this 4 aspects of this. The first is to kind of acknowledge the opposite of surrender, the role of willful practice, because it's certainly a part of discipline is consciously developing your will. And I'd like to talk about what it means to surrender to presence. What does it mean to surrender to the here and now? And then to talk about what does it mean to surrender to your path? What does it mean to surrender to your personal dharma, your personal destiny? And fourth, what does it mean to surrender to reality itself? So a little bit on willful practice. And I love this story. I believe Pema Chodron tells this story. When she was first learning meditation, she went to a teacher, and the teacher said, okay, so here's the technique. Bring your attention to your breath, relax, but bring your attention to your breath. When the mind wanders, bring it back to the breath. So she went off to practice, and the first 45-minute session, she realized she never once was aware of the breath. The next session, a little bit better. And as she practiced through the day, she felt, she was making a little more progress and being more aware of her breathing. So she went back to her teacher at the end of the day. She said, okay, I think I got it. I think I'm ready now for the next level of instruction. And the teacher smiled and said, okay, so you want to watch your breath and relax. When the mind wanders, bring it back to the breath. Same instruction. That practice, as you know, is challenging and very powerful. When you use an anchor such as the breath, and again, the breath isn't the only anchor. You can use sound, you can use feeling tone. But in the tradition of insight meditation, we're using sensation. So it's in the sensory field. But when you bring your attention to the breath, when you actually feel and experience the breath, and why I often say, can you feel it on the inside? It's not an intellectual awareness of the breath, it's an embodied experience of the breath. That when you have that conscious experience of this breath right now, you're here. The body only knows the present moment. And over time, you begin to gather your awareness in the here and now, which opens up some pretty interesting doorways. So if you are using breath as your anchor, I find that there are 3 little practices that help me to sort of sustain attention to the breath. And I thought we might just do a short little practice just to kind of review these. If you've sat with me, you've heard me share these before. They're kind of classical. But if you like, you can close your eyes. And just notice the natural flow of breath. And sometimes when the mind is really scattered, it's helpful to count the breath. And one way to count the breath is at the top of the inhalation, you just count 1. And at the top of the next breath, 2. And then continuing to count your breath to 5, and then you can begin again. So you might just do that for right now, counting your inhalations from 1 to 5. Now you may notice in counting the breath, you lose count and you begin again, but this is a way to sort of train the mind to pay attention to something very, very subtle. The next thing you can explore, and again, we'll take just maybe, 30, 45 seconds for this. Again, just feel the breath on the inside and ask yourself, is the length of this in-breath any different than the length of the in-breath preceding it? Now the third element you might explore, and again, this will be just for maybe 30 seconds. As you kind of specify where you pay attention to the breath. And again, classically, it's at the rim of the nostrils or the septum, or it might be the belly, or a general sense of the breath. Bring your attention right to that spot. And as you feel the breath, just sense if you can scan and notice if you can find any new sensations. Now, if you like, you can kind of release all the techniques and just take a moment and notice if you feel any shift over the last maybe 2 minutes altogether. And you may find that there's more of a sense of embodiment, more of a sense of here and now. And this is an important aspect of meditation, is moving from the cognitive to the experience of here and now, moving from the story to the actual, direct, tangible, sensorial feeling of here and now. And this is what sets the ground. And of course, you can go deeper and deeper into this practice. If you get trained in sort of deeper concentration, you focus on kind of the gross aspect of the breath, and then you start focusing on the sense of the breath outside your body, which is wild. And that's that sense of the movement of the breath just at the rim of the nostrils and the upper lip. Very, very subtle. Boy, oh boy, do you have to be relaxed and alert to be able to track that. But the more you do that, the more concentrated you get, and the more you arrive, and the more there's this incredible sense of a presence that begins to flow. You build a sense of resilience. You can begin to see more into the moment-to-moment relationship to what's happening. So these willful practices are really powerful. Learning how to build that resilience to stay focused. And when you explore how focus and willful practice shows up in life, when you can sustain attention on wherever you place your attention, you get things done. You get much sharper awareness. And there are limitations to willful practice. As I've often said, there are very, very concentrated people on the planet who are miserable. But what concentration and willful practice can do is you start to build the foundation for mindfulness. You begin to be more aware of what we could call the witness, or more aware of the observer. And we begin to open into mindfulness, the capacity to observe without judgment. In my conversation with Tracy this last week, he was talking about in his intensive training that you're paying attention to the object, but you're also paying attention to the periphery. Like you're noticing that you're paying attention. And you may recall, it's the difference between watching a movie and being completely caught in the movie and watching a movie and being aware of the movie as you're watching it. It's subtle, but really, really powerful. This is the arising of mindfulness and this two-part definition that I love of meditation. It's noticing what's happening as it's happening. That's concentration. But also noticing your relationship to what is happening. That's mindfulness. Noticing if there's any leaning in, any pushing away. Noticing the attitude in your mind. Noticing your relationship to what's happening. This is what sets the stage for insight, for all kinds of really juicy stuff. So we have practices of doing, kind of the skillful means for directing your attention in a willful way. We then have these practices of observing, of being that impartial observer, observing without preference. And we also have these practices of allowing. And so what does that mean to allow? My first experience of this was way back in the ashram days, and we did a lot of willful practice, a lot of postures that were really challenging and these kind of somewhat insane breathing techniques that really pushed the edge, and how you breathe affects how you feel. So, the science of pranayama, the science of yogic breathing is amazing because you can shift your state in minutes. We also did some practices of surrender, and part of what we did in Kripalu Yoga is this sense of like you activate energy and then you release it and you let it flow. So we did these really cool posture flow things and stuff like that. But the meditation we did wasn't quite as clear as what we did in our practice. So we would have these incredible world-class teachers come through, and occasionally they would lead us in retreats. So we had this one fellow, this is, 30 years ago. His name was Rishi Prabhakar. Really, really cool guy. He'd done a lot of teaching in the ministries in India and so forth. So he was leading us on a 3-day retreat, and we learned these breathing techniques and in different mudras. You'd breathe and you'd do these different ways that you would hold your hands and your fingers. It was interesting stuff. But then when it came to meditation, the instructions were like nothing I'd ever heard. We were really, really, well, many of us were really, really focused on, enlightenment or bust. Whatever you tell me to do. Tell me to wear red underwear, I'm going to wear red underwear. And we didn't want to miss out on anything. So we always took copious notes, or at least I did. So he's sitting up on the dais and he looks around and he says, "For this retreat, I want you to do nothing." So I wrote that down. And then he noticed that some of us were up front, were writing it down. And he goes, "No." He said, "For this retreat, I want you to do nothing." So I wrote it down again and I underlined it. And he said, put the pen down. For this retreat, I want you to do nothing. 2.5 days. We were all sitting in grids. And I found myself just going insane. What does doing nothing mean? And more than once looking around and thinking, am I doing nothing better than she's doing nothing? The result of that retreat was feeling more relaxed than I had felt in maybe ever. There was just this sense of allowing the moment to be, just allowing the moment to be. It was incredible. It was such a powerful insight for me. So a little experiment again, if you like. You can close your eyes. So I'm going to offer you a 30-second practice, and I'm going to time you here. So for the next 30 seconds, I want you to do nothing. So how'd you do? Success? Doing nothing can be maddening. But what we have available to us, and I really see meditation is training in awareness. And you realize that you can narrow your attention like a laser. You can widen your attention to notice flow or the stream. And then you can utterly open your attention to 360 degrees. And what really cooks your noodle is when you explore both. The kind of the flower of Dzogchen meditation is in these two lines. And you might even just kind of try these on if you like. You can close your eyes. Utterly awake. Sense doors wide open. Utterly open, non-fixating awareness. And can you sense that? What it's like to have the sense doors wide open, all the senses, and at the same time a quality of non-fixating attention. It's pretty mind-blowing. So, there's this backdrop of vast awareness, vast wakefulness. That when you explore letting go, just sort of surrendering into the presence, that there's this sort of ever-present quality of awareness. And you notice sometimes, at least I notice that if I am having a lot of dreams, if I'm in one of those periods of my life, sometimes I have a little dread when I go to sleep. Because in those hypnagogic states, those dream states, the mind can go anywhere, and it's a wild ride. Ramana Maharshi described the mind as a drunken monkey stung by scorpions. And, the dream state is sort of this amazing process of fragments of thoughts that kind of get pulled into these really crazy narratives. So when we talk about like letting go and surrendering into something more vast than the finite mind, it can be really disorienting and inappropriate sometimes. But in many ways, this is perhaps what meditation is all about. It's about surrendering to presence. It's when you're practicing concentration, when you're watching the breath, you're letting go of the past-oriented thoughts. You're letting go of the future-oriented thoughts. And you're really surrendering to here and now. And when you are practicing sort of mindfulness, where you're aware of what's happening as it's happening, aware of your relationship to what's happening, there's even this sense of like sort of surrendering into seeing the attitude in the mind. And again, coming back to the sense of, can I allow, can I let things be? So meditation in many ways is a practice of sort of surrendering into the here and now, surrendering in the presence. And we know from all the studies that when you do that, amazing things happen. Your body self-regulates. There's more emotional equilibrium. There's more mental clarity. There's more of this sense of like a strengthened witness, more resilience, more of a capacity to be able to be with whatever's there. But what happens when you surrender into your life? And this is a really juicy one, I find. Because what does surrender mean? On a retreat, and on our intensive retreats, there's either they're in groups or you're with a teacher for like 15 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes. So I was having an individual interview with a woman who had been in a really, really rough relationship. She had gone to therapy, she'd done prayer, she'd been journaling about it. And for her, what she was telling herself was that the right thing to do was to stay in it no matter what. But as she just continued to sort of like come back into the here and now and kind of feel it from all these different angles, because of course the mind is always moving, always analyzing, she came to a place of recognizing, I'm done. I've had enough, and I can't go on as it is. Now, what's interesting there is what was she surrendering? And in many ways, what she was surrendering was her story. Her story was the right thing to do is stay in this no matter what, no matter how abusive, no matter what, you made a pact. But what you realize, and again, part of the practice is kind of built on these words from the Buddha, allegedly. When the Buddha said, nothing whatsoever is to be clung to as I or mine. When she began to soften her story, she began to surrender into a deeper truth. And that sense of like, do I stay in this relationship? Do I go? Of course, is incredibly fraught. But at some point, I think we get to a place of what we can call choiceless choice. Yes, you have options, but in your heart of hearts, you know this is what needs to be done. And she knew, as she began to explore, what if I surrender into this feeling of this is what I need to do? She began to recognize that what she was surrendering into was deeper challenges to how to move on, how to go through a certain familiarity and comfort in that relationship, but moving on to a life that was calling her. I think sometimes we think of surrender as we're letting go of the bad stuff, but really what we're letting go of is our story. And then we're opening into a whole new world, a whole new realm. And it doesn't mean that everything is rosy. And for her, it wasn't. She had a lot of inner work to do. And sometimes we have a sense of like surrendering into something that it's sort of not just moving away from something unpleasant, but we're moving towards something that just calls us. And so there's someone I know from years ago, took a pottery class as a way of getting some credits because he didn't want to do anything academic. And he found he loved pottery. And he thought, I just want to do more of this. I don't know why, but I love what it feels like. And then he explored other ways of like throwing pots. Then he got really interested in in the ancient Japanese techniques with pottery, and then he just said, I just have to go to Japan. And he went to Japan and he apprenticed and became a master pottery maker. And he made like high-end pottery for restaurants. And his life utterly, utterly changed. And he just said, I just couldn't not do it. Have you ever had that sense of, I just can't not do this? This just has my name on it. And sometimes there's a real surrender to that, And again, I think of it as choiceless choice. That, yeah, you've got options, but if you really, really sense deeply inside, this is what's calling me. Of course, the opposite of surrender is fighting, is resistance. A friend of mine was in a very, very stressful job. Really didn't like it. Spent a lot of his time looking for the exits and looking for any way he could move on, any new career that he could move into, and was really fixated on what wasn't working. And then he explored in his meditation practice. He moved into the practice of RAIN, and you may be familiar with RAIN. The acronym, the R is to recognize what's presenting. The A is the sense of you can allow it. The I is to actively investigate what's there, somatically, in thoughts and beliefs. And then exploring if you can call on nurturing, loving presence to sort of inform that experience, if you will. And so he thought, this is so persistent and so sticky. Let me really investigate this as part of his morning meditation. So he kind of named the resistance, he named the stress and the everything he didn't like about it, and what he might be missing out on in life because he had this job that he had to do and it was sucking up his life force. And he sensed, can I allow this? Can I make room for this? And so he said, well, let me look at this deeper. And he began to investigate, moving into the I of the process and just feeling the tension, feeling the tightness, and feeling the kind of the anger that he felt stuck in this position. And then he called on the nurturing, the kindness, compassion, empathy. And just by kind of calling on this, he explored what it's like if I just bring some kindness into this feeling inside, this tightness, this clench, what would happen? And he began to feel a softening. And then he began to recognize all the good that was going on in his job, that he actually had a job of tremendous influence. And he kind of reconnected with the why that he said yes to the job in the first place. And a big part of this job was really service-oriented. That he was having a really big effect in the world. And he thought in his executive position, the relationships he had with board members and the ways that investors could impact their mission even more. And the more he sat with it, the more he began to kind of feel that softening inside and more back to the why he was called there. And as he sort of let the whole practice go and just sort of sat there with kind of what we call after the rain, just sort of like resting in presence, he just had this thought, this very simple thought. He just said, these are the cards I've been dealt. These are the cards I'm holding. I'm here. I have this opportunity to serve. I have this position of influence. I have these challenges. And he found himself re-surrendering back into the why that he was called there in the first place. So sometimes it's really helpful to look at the resistance. And I often find that to the degree I am resisting something, if I can really investigate that resistance, on the other side of that resistance is something really powerful. And again, as you kind of surrender to your inner knowing, it might be, yeah, it's time to go. Or it might be, yeah, there's a way for me to re-engage that's different than how I was before. Another aspect that shows up in surrender, and I find this to be fascinating. You know, when we're practicing, when we're kind of engaged in practice, we sometimes we have these glimpses. And the glimpses are into what we could call reality or our true nature. And for many people, it's a sense of I and mind falls away. It's a sense of spaciousness, a sense of loving awareness. And those moments, of course, are tremendously powerful. And I think in many ways, enlightenment, if you will, is really a series of these glimpses where you sense a deep expansiveness. Again, a sense of I and mine is sort of dispelled, the sense of like non-judging, preferential, like clear seeing. And it is not uncommon that when people have those moments of kind of clear seeing, it's then when they realize what their real work is. Or someone can have just a sense of being kind of released from the grip of their tension and their struggle. And they have sort of that clear seeing, which often is accompanied by some form of loving awareness. And then they realize, now I see I need to go back and heal my family stuff. So surrender is not about really kind of like giving up anything. It's about surrendering to a deepening truth. When Mahatma Gandhi was thrown out of the train because of the color of his skin, and when he was sitting on the train tracks, his surrender was not about surrendering to the system. It was not about just surrendering to apartheid as it was. He surrendered to his deeper purpose. And I find that to be such a helpful distinction. When we are surrendering into a deeper sense of reality. And the doorway is that letting go of I and mine. And so again, we have focus in our practice, concentration, arriving, gathering, willful. We have this sense of like opening to the flow or the stream, establishing the sense of who you are as the observer, your capacity to observe through that lens of non-judging, non-preferential awareness. We have the practice of letting go, of letting be, of sort of abiding in presence. And throughout this, the more we explore what it means to surrender to the here and now, the more we open more and more to the mystery. That's kind of like the only way I can describe it, is we just open up to this ineffable mystery. So, not to get too woo-woo, but I'd like to talk a little bit about, in these final minutes, around what surrender. What happens when we surrender? So here are a few words that kind of guide us toward this sense of opening into surrendering I and mine. If you like, you can close your eyes and just kind of allow these words to kind of flow through. And this is really kind of the training where we kind of move from like having the object of the breath or the object of sound, where the object becomes awareness itself. And the analogy is the sky. So your anchor, if you will, is this sense of the sky. So here come the words. Send your mind into the external expanse of sky. Observe whether or not it comes or goes. If the mind, when observed, neither comes nor goes, then look inside toward your mind and observe whether or not there is someone causing thoughts to arise. If there is no agent who makes the movement of thoughts, observe then whether or not the mind has color or shape. When you arrive at an emptiness free from color or shape, observe then whether or not it has a center or a fringe. When you can see that there is neither center nor fringe, then observe whether or not there is an outside or an inside. This awareness, free from an inside or an outside, is open like the sky. It is penetrating wakefulness, free from limitations and partiality. Within the vast and open space of this all-embracing mind, all phenomena manifest like rainbows in the sky. So if you like, you can deepen the breath. So that reading can be a little hard to track because it's outlining this whole practice of observation. And the observation is really based on this suspension of I and mine, this surrender of I, me, and mine. And then to pay attention, to pay really, really deep attention. To notice the nature of the mind, whether there's anyone in there moving the mind. And to notice the quality of the mind itself, and if it has a shape or a color, if it has a center or a fringe, whether there's an inside or an outside to the mind itself. And it points toward this sense of moving from what we could call sort of like local awareness. And I always find it interesting, one of my practices is whenever I'm observing something, I can ask myself, where is the observer? And you might even just, we'll try this on, we've just a few minutes left. Bring your attention to your breath. You can close your eyes. Can you locate the observer? For many of us, we tend to have some kind of amorphous sense kind of in the head, the eyes or the brain or the back of the head. And you might just sense for a moment, what is it that is aware of the observer? And can you soften that sense of its location? And just notice what's there. So if you like, you can open your eyes or remain with them closed. In our practice, we're surrendering the past, we're surrendering the future to arrive in the here and now. And as our practice deepens and gets more subtle, we're surrendering the subtlety of how we try to control our experience. And oftentimes what happens is there's this deepening sense of the witness, this sort of like unblinking eye of awareness itself. And yet there's still a sense of I and mine associated with this sense of the word. I am the observer of what's happening. And yet, is it possible to surrender even more? To surrender that sense of I and mine? It can sometimes give us this glimpse into moving from local awareness to what we call non-local awareness, to awareness itself. It's not easily done. And yet, we get these glimpses, and I think it's so important to name them. And the inquiry is that when you surrender that sense of I and mine, what you may find is that you will come a little bit closer to that sense of choiceless choice. That sense of what it is that you can't not do. Getting closer to your sense of your work, your calling in the world. And the interesting thing is, no one can do this for you. Quite often we're looking outside of us for guidelines. We're looking for a teacher or teachings that are going to say, do this, don't do that. And there are plenty of teachings out there that will say, this is exactly what you do. But I find it's so important to keep coming back. And for me, those alleged final words of the Buddha, where he said, be a light unto yourself. Do not look for teachers. Do not look for scripture. Do not look for external teachings. You must be a light unto yourself. Verify them for yourself. That pointing out can be very, very disorienting and at the same time empowering. So as expansive as this stuff can get, it's so important to remember that part of the beauty of this practice, where it comes full circle, is this is a deeply embodied practice. Can you be aware of this breath? And can you be aware of the mystery and the vastness and the incredible mystery of what it means to be alive? And to open to that deepening sense of what it is that you can't not do in your life. I hope, I pray this has been helpful. It's been a very, very deep inquiry for me as things seem to be falling away, things seem to be calling, and more I find myself asking, does this resonate? Is what I'm being called to, is this a false calling, or is this something that I can't not do in my life? Thank you so much for your time and attention. May you continue to be guided by both wisdom and that compassionate heart. Thank you so much, and many, many blessings in your practice.